They said no man alive could ride the wild stallion. A millionaire staked his pride and $1 million on that belief. Seasoned riders broke bones trying. But then, out of the dust, came a barefoot orphan with nothing but courage and a whisper. What happened next shocked an entire state, sparked a courtroom battle, and proved that freedom can never be bought. It must be chosen. The Texas sun burned like a furnace over the hill country, bleaching the limestone hills and throwing long shadows across the endless fields of bluestem and mesquite. The Whitmore Ranch rose from the land like a monument to pride. White-pillared porches, red-tiled roofs, and fences that stretched farther than the eye could follow. Everything about it screamed wealth and power. Inside the main barn, a crowd had gathered. Wealthy ranchers in crisp hats, oil men with whiskey in hand, and seasoned cowboys who had drifted in just to see the spectacle. They all whispered the same name, half in awe, half in mockery. Midnight Storm. The horse stood alone in a steel corral at the center, a black Mustang cross with shoulders like a war horse and eyes like burning coal. His coat gleamed as if it had swallowed the sun, and his hooves struck sparks when they hit the packed dirt. He had already thrown the best trainers in the state, some leaving with broken ribs, others with their pride shattered. At the head of the gathering, Charles Whitmore adjusted his linen jacket and tapped his silver-tipped cane against the ground. 62 years old, with hair as white as prairie cotton and skin browned by decades of ranching and oil money, he carried himself like a man used to command. His fortune, earned from both cattle and crude, had made him one of the wealthiest men in Texas. But it was his arrogance that filled the room more than his money. He raised a glass of bourbon, his voice carrying like thunder across the barn. "No man alive will ever ride my stallion," he declared, lips curling into a smug smile. "Not a single damn soul." The crowd murmured. Some chuckled, others shifted uncomfortably, but all eyes turned back to the stallion in the corral. Midnight Storm pawed the dirt, ears pinned back, daring anyone to enter. Whitmore went on, savoring the moment. "I'll make it interesting," he said, letting the bourbon catch the light. $1 million, cash, to the man who lasts 3 minutes on his back. A hush fell over the room before erupting into chatter. $1 million, enough to buy a ranch, enough to start an empire. The offer spread like wildfire, and already men whispered about who would dare take it. A cowboy in a dust-stained hat spat on the ground. 3 minutes? Hell, I wouldn't last 3 seconds. Another, a trainer who had tried and failed weeks earlier, muttered, "That horse ain't meant for riding. He's the devil dressed in black." But Whitmore only smiled wider, soaking in the fear and fascination that his wager created. Pride burned in his chest. To him, the horse was not a beast to be understood. It was a trophy, a challenge, a way to prove that nothing in this world stood beyond his command. From the corral, Midnight Storm snorted, the sound sharp as a whip crack. His nostrils flared, breath steaming in the hot air. The muscles along his flanks quivered with tension, as if he could feel the arrogance in the voices around him and rejected it outright. The crowd stepped back from the rail instinctively, though no gate had been opened. Whitmore's foreman, a wiry man named Cole Brandt, leaned close to his boss. "Sir, you sure about this? You're inviting half the state to take a crack at him. Someone might—" "No one will," Whitmore cut him off, his eyes glinting cold steel. "And if by some miracle they do, I'll have my entertainment. Either way, I win." The words carried the finality of a sentence. Around them, the smell of horse sweat and hay hung heavy, mixing with the sweet burn of bourbon. Outside, cicadas screamed in the oaks. Inside, the bet had been cast like a gauntlet thrown to the dirt. Men scribbled their names, promising to return with their best riders. Some laughed about the money, others cursed Whitmore under their breath. But no one doubted that the challenge would draw crowds from far beyond the hill country. Whitmore drained his glass and set it down with a sharp clink. His gaze returned to the horse, who stared back, unblinking, unbowed. For the briefest moment, something flickered in Whitmore's chest. Not fear, but the sting of being challenged by a creature he could not bend. He turned away, refusing to give it weight. To him, this was sport, nothing more. "To all of you," he said, lifting his cane toward the corral, "remember this day. Midnight Storm will break every last one of you, and when he does, I'll remind you what real power looks like." The barn erupted in voices. Bets placed, whiskey poured, challenges made. But above it all lingered the sharp crack of a hoof against steel, a sound like defiance itself echoing in the Texas heat. And though none of them knew it yet, beyond the ranch fences, beyond the limestone ridges and sunburnt fields, a boy who owned nothing but his courage was about to change everything. The morning heat had already begun to rise over the low streets of East Austin. Dust hung in the air, stirred by old pickups rattling down cracked asphalt, and the smell of frying bacon drifted from diners that served working men before the day grew unbearable. In a small boarding stable on the edge of town, hidden behind a rusting chain-link fence, a boy worked with the quiet determination of someone twice his age. Ethan Miller was 13, though the hollow look in his dark eyes made him seem older. His father had been a cowboy who rode rodeos when times were good and broke horses for cash when times weren't. Years ago, an accident during a bronc ride had taken him away, leaving Ethan alone with memories that felt more like dreams now. His mother had passed when he was a child. The details were blurry, softened by time and silence. What Ethan had left were calluses on his hands from mucking out stalls, a bed in the loft of the stable that smelled of hay and mildew, and a handful of words from his father that rang in his head every time he touched a horse. "A horse isn't owned, son. He chooses his rider. If you want his trust, give him yours first." The stable wasn't much. The wood was weathered and the tin roof rattled when the wind came off the plains. Yet, to Ethan, it was home, or at least the closest thing to it. He rose before dawn to sweep aisles and feed the boarders' horses. In return, the stable master, a gruff man named Mr. Ellis, gave him a bunk in the loft and a plate of beans at supper. It wasn't kindness so much as convenience. Ethan was another pair of hands that cost nothing. Still, Ethan took it without complaint. That morning, as he forked hay into a stall, the crackling voice of an old radio drifted from the tack room. The announcer's words made him freeze. "Billionaire rancher Charles Whitmore has issued a challenge. $1 million to anyone who can ride his black stallion, Midnight Storm, for 3 minutes. Riders from across the state are expected to try their hand at the Whitmore Ranch in the coming weeks." The pitch of Ethan's breath caught. He dropped the fork, straw falling in uneven piles. The name Midnight Storm felt like thunder rolling through his chest. He had heard whispers about that horse. Wild, dangerous, a Mustang mix that no one could handle. They said he had thrown seasoned cowboys like rag dolls, leaving them bruised and broken. But Ethan wasn't thinking about the $1 million. The thought barely registered. What filled him instead was a sharp ache that somehow sounded like his father's voice. "Somewhere out there is a horse that will understand you. Find him, and you'll never be alone." The radio faded under the scrape of boots on concrete. Mr. Ellis appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands with a rag. "You hear that foolishness? Damn, Whitmore's turned a horse into a sideshow." Ethan kept his eyes lowered. "What kind of horse is he?" "A devil, that's what," Ellis muttered. "Jet black, Mustang blood, strong enough to tear through a fence if he wanted. Whitmore's been trying to break him for months, and the bastard still fights like the day he was caught. But you don't need to be thinking on it, boy. That's not for folks like us." Ethan nodded, though the words slipped past him. Something had already rooted in his chest, a seed that refused to be ignored. That night, when the barn lights flicked off and the other stable hands left, Ethan lay on his cot staring at the rafters. The air smelled of leather and manure, but beneath it lingered the memory of his childhood, the warmth of a campfire, the steady rhythm of a horse's breathing, his father's rough hand on his shoulder. He whispered into the darkness, as if someone might hear, "Maybe he's the one." The following day, as he carried buckets of water down the aisle, 2 ranch hands from the north side came in leading a trailer horse. They were loud, bragging about the Whitmore challenge. "You gonna give it a shot?" one asked the other. "Hell no. I'd rather keep my bones where they are. But think of it, $1 million, enough to buy half this town. Yeah, and enough to bury you when that devil stomps you into the dirt." Ethan stood still, gripping the handle of the bucket so hard his knuckles whitened. He wanted to ask them if anyone at all, had ever tried just talking to the horse. But he kept quiet. That evening, as twilight poured gold across the sky, Ethan climbed the fence behind the stable and sat staring westward. The horizon stretched endlessly, the sun sinking behind the hills like an ember dying in ash. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridges and the mesquite, lay the Whitmore Ranch. Somewhere out there stood Midnight Storm. His stomach twisted with fear, but it wasn't fear of the horse. It was fear of being laughed at, of being told he had no right to dream. He pressed his fists against his knees and remembered his father's last ride, the one that had ended in dust and silence. Ethan had been 5 years old, clutching the railing, watching his father thrown. The crowd gasped, the announcer shouted, and then came the stillness that stole the air from the boy's lungs. In that memory, he had wanted to scream, to run, to beg someone to help, but no one could. Since then, horses were the only things that made him feel less alone. Now, hearing of Midnight Storm, Ethan felt the pull of fate. The horse was said to be untamable, dangerous, wild. But maybe what he needed wasn't another whip, another rider, another show of power. Maybe he needed someone who knew what it was like to be left behind, to fight just to keep standing. That night he packed a small cloth bag, a piece of stale bread, a worn canteen, and the pocket knife that had belonged to his father. He left a note for Ellis, just 3 words scrawled in pencil. "Thank you, sir." Then he slipped out the back gate while the town slept, the cicadas shrieking in the humid dark. The road stretched long and lonely ahead of him. Each step kicked up dust that clung to his bare ankles. The moon rode high over the Texas hills, lighting his path with silver. Ethan kept walking, whispering softly to himself, as if the horse might already be listening. "Wait for me, Midnight Storm. I'm coming." The Whitmore Ranch had become a theater, and the whole of Texas seemed eager for a ticket. Word of Charles Whitmore's $1 million challenge spread like wildfire through saloons, rodeo arenas, and dusty truck stops. Men drove for hours, some from as far away as New Mexico and Oklahoma, each arriving with bravado on their lips and a gleam in their eye. They came in polished boots or worn spurs, carrying ropes and saddles that had seen 100 rides. They came believing they could be the one. The crowd grew larger with each attempt. The ranch hands built makeshift stands around the corral, and cars lined the fences like it was a fairground. Whitmore thrived on it. He dressed in tailored suits each day, leaning against the rail with a glass of bourbon, savoring every gasp, every cheer, every groan when another man failed. To him, it was theater, and he was the maestro. The first rider to try was a bronc-buster named Luke Carter, a rangy cowboy with scars up and down his arms. He climbed the rail with a grin that told the crowd he believed the money was already his. Midnight Storm stood in the middle of the corral, ears pinned, eyes glowing like coals. When the gate opened, Luke swung into the saddle with the ease of experience. For half a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the storm broke loose. Midnight Storm launched into the air with a violence that seemed unnatural, twisting his body like a hurricane condensed into flesh and bone. Dust exploded under his hooves. Luke barely had time to shout before he was airborne, crashing into the dirt so hard the breath left his lungs in a sickening wheeze. The crowd roared, half in awe, half in horror. Luke staggered up, clutching his side, and limped from the arena without looking back. Whitmore smirked, raising his glass. Next! Over the next days, more came. A rodeo champion from San Antonio, a trainer from Oklahoma who claimed to have broken wild mustangs by the dozen, even a rancher's son whose family fortune rivaled Whitmore's. They all swaggered into the corral, and they all fell. One man left with a shattered collarbone, another with blood streaming from his nose. One had to be carried out on a stretcher, his leg bent at an angle that made the crowd go silent. Every failure only fed Whitmore's arrogance. He made speeches from the rail, his voice dripping with contempt. You see, money cannot buy what does not exist. No man will ever tame Midnight Storm. His friends laughed, clinking glasses. The spectacle became more than a bet. It became Whitmore's declaration of dominance over man and beast alike. Yet, amid the chaos, whispers began to spread. Some said the horse wasn't just wild, but wounded. They spoke of the way his eyes never softened, how his anger seemed personal. A few old ranchers swore they could see it. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. This was mistrust, deep and carved into his soul. Someone had hurt him before he ever arrived at Whitmore's ranch. Still, men kept coming. The money was too much to ignore. Families drove down in caravans, mothers clutching children, while fathers watched the corral with envy in their eyes. Every failed attempt was met with cheers from the crowd, then silence as the rider limped away. The horse stood tall after each, victory, chest heaving, nostrils flared, never bowing his head. On the 10th day, after another rider was carted off with his arm broken clean through, Whitmore turned to his foreman, Cole Brandt, with a cruel glint in his eye. If no one rides him by the end of the month, I'll put a bullet in that beast. I bought him to be ridden, not to waste my time. Cole hesitated. Sir, folks won't like that. They came here for a show, not to watch a killing. Then they'll learn, Whitmore snapped. Everything has a price, even mercy. The words chilled Cole, though he said nothing more. The crowd didn't hear them, but the horse did. Midnight Storm tossed his head, eyes burning, as though he understood. By then, Ethan Miller had been walking for days, following the long road out of Austin toward the hill country. Dust coated his bare feet and clung to his ragged jeans. He passed fields of sunflowers leaning toward the sky, creeks running low in the summer heat, and roadside crosses where strangers had been lost on highways. Each night he slept beneath the stars, his father's pocket knife clutched in his hand, his heart pounding with equal parts fear and resolve. And all the while at Whitmore Ranch, riders fell. Pride cracked. Bones broke. The legend of Midnight Storm grew with every failed attempt. The crowd swelled, hungry for spectacle, while Whitmore sat above them all, king of a cruel game. The month ticked on, and though no one knew it yet, the real challenger was drawing closer with each mile. A boy with nothing in his pockets but a memory, and nothing in his heart but the belief that a horse's spirit could not be bought or broken. The Whitmore Ranch gates were tall, iron-wrought, and intimidating, standing like a challenge against the endless Texas sky. The road leading there was lined with pickup trucks and dust-choked cars, engines still ticking hot as their owners made their way inside to witness yet another attempt at conquering the black stallion. It was no longer just a wager. It had become a pilgrimage, a carnival of pride, pain, and whispered hopes of fortune. Ethan Miller arrived with his shoulders stooped from the long walk. His clothes clung to him with sweat, his bare feet cut and blistered by gravel roads. In one hand he carried his father's pocket knife, and in the other, a cloth bag so light it might as well have been empty. Yet his eyes, dark, steady, and determined, were alive with something no one at the ranch could recognize: conviction without arrogance. The guards at the gate spotted him before he got too close. Two broad men in pressed shirts and polished boots leaned against the posts, rifles hanging lazy across their shoulders. They squinted at the ragged boy trudging toward them, lips curling with disdain. "Hey, kid," one of them barked, spitting into the dust. "This ain't no orphanage. Turn around." Ethan swallowed, tightening his grip on the strap of his belt. "I came to see Mr. Whitmore." The men laughed, a sharp sound that carried across the hot air. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't take meetings with beggars. Go on, before you get yourself in trouble." "I didn't come to beg," Ethan replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I came to ride the horse." The laughter grew louder. One of the guards slapped his thigh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Listen to him. Ride Midnight Storm? Kid, men twice your size can't last a heartbeat in that corral. You'd be snapped like a twig." Ethan didn't flinch. "Mr. Whitmore said anyone could try. I'm anyone." The guards exchanged a glance. There was something in the boy's eyes, defiance maybe, or something harder to name. It wasn't bravado, it was belief. Finally, one of them grinned wickedly. "All right. You want a meeting with the boss? Let's see how he laughs at this." They marched him past the gates, through the ranch that spread like a kingdom across the land. Fences held prize cattle, and the main house stood tall, its white walls gleaming like bone in the sun. As they approached the wide porch, the sound of voices and clinking glasses grew louder. Charles Whitmore was at breakfast on his terrace, shaded beneath a broad awning. He wore a crisp white suit despite the heat, a Panama hat perched over his silver hair. Around him lounged his wealthy friends, oilmen, bankers, landowners, each sipping bourbon as if it were water. They turned curious eyes toward the strange procession. Two guards and a barefoot boy, dusty from the road. "What's this?" Whitmore asked, without bothering to look up from his plate. The guard smirked. "Says he came to ride Midnight Storm, sir." A ripple of laughter rolled across the terrace. One man nearly spilled his drink, shaking his head. Another leaned forward, eyes wide in mock disbelief. That scrawny thing. He can't weigh more than a sack of oats. My God, what a show this will be. Finally, Whitmore lifted his gaze, his steel-gray eyes fixing on Ethan. The boy met his stare without blinking. For a moment, Whitmore studied him the way one might study an insect that had crawled onto the table. Then a smile crept across his lips, cold and cruel. "You want to ride my stallion?" he asked. "Yes, sir." Ethan's voice was quiet but unshaken. "Do you even know what you're saying?" Whitmore pressed. "Men who've trained horses their whole lives couldn't last on him. He'll throw you, trample you, kill you without a thought. And yet you think you—" He let the words hang, waiting for the boy to break. But Ethan only stood straighter. "I don't want to break him. I want to talk to him." The terrace erupted in laughter. Glasses clinked, chairs scraped as men doubled over, tears forming at the corners of their eyes. "Talk to him," he says, "like he's a preacher come to save a horse's soul." Yet Whitmore didn't laugh. He raised a hand, silencing the others. There was a strange flicker in his expression, not respect, but interest. This wasn't the bravado he was used to. It was something different, something that made him want to see the boy fail even more. "Very well," Whitmore said, his voice smooth and mocking. "If it's death you're after, I won't deny you the stage. But remember this, 3 minutes. If you last, you earn the prize. If you don't—" He leaned back in his chair, sipping his bourbon. "Well, the ranch is always in need of hands to muck out the stalls." The crowd of guests cheered the announcement, eager for the spectacle. Bets were placed on how long the boy would survive. 10 seconds, 15 at most. No one wagered beyond a minute. The guards led Ethan across the yard toward the corral, where Midnight Storm stood waiting. Dust swirled in the air, the scent of hay and sweat heavy on the wind. People followed, forming a circle along the railings, their faces hungry for the drama about to unfold. Inside the corral, the stallion pawed the ground, black mane whipping like a banner in the heat. His eyes burned with mistrust, his muscles rippling with tension. Every inch of him radiated danger. The gate creaked open. Ethan stepped forward, the world narrowing to the sound of his own heartbeat. Around him the crowd jeered, placing bets, calling him a fool. Ahead of him stood the horse that no man could tame, the creature said to be worth a fortune and doomed to die if he resisted too long. He gripped the strap of his bag once more, remembering his father's words. "A horse isn't owned, son. He chooses his rider." And with that, the barefoot boy crossed into the corral. The corral had never been so quiet. The crowd pressed against the rails, their laughter fading to a tense murmur as the barefoot boy stepped onto the dust. Ethan's figure was small against the vast black shape of Midnight Storm, but there was something in the way he carried himself, straight-backed, steady-eyed, that unsettled even the most jaded spectators. The stallion stood at the far end, ears pinned, nostrils flaring as if he could already sense the difference in this challenger. Ethan's heart pounded, but he forced himself not to rush. The dust shifted beneath his bare feet as he crossed a few paces into the ring, then stopped. He let the silence settle, closing his eyes against the jeers from behind the fence. He didn't speak loudly, didn't wave his arms like the others had. Instead, he sank to the ground, folding his legs under him, hands resting loosely on his knees. The crowd erupted in confusion. "What the hell's he doing?" someone barked. "He's sitting down?" Another voice laughed bitterly. "That horse is gonna run him right over." Even Whitmore, watching from his shaded chair, arched an eyebrow in amusement. But Ethan wasn't listening to them. He was listening to the horse. He breathed slowly, letting the hot air burn through his chest, then whispered, barely loud enough for those nearest the rail to hear. "I know what it's like to be trapped. I know what it's like to not trust anyone. I'm not here to break you." Midnight Storm's ears flicked, the muscles across his shoulders quivering. He pawed the dirt, a warning, but his eyes stayed fixed on the boy. The crowd leaned forward. The hush grew heavier, as though the whole ranch held its breath. "I don't have whips," Ethan continued softly. "I don't have spurs. I don't want to own you. I just want to listen." His voice shook, but it was steady with conviction, carrying an honesty no one else had offered. For long seconds, nothing happened. The stallion snorted, pacing along the rail, every line of his body taut with suspicion. Dust swirled in the sunlight, heat rising in waves. Ethan remained motionless, eyes lowered, the image of vulnerability itself. He had placed himself in the most dangerous position, on the ground, defenseless, with 1,000 pounds of muscle and rage watching him. Then, slowly, Midnight Storm's gait changed. The stamping lessened, the arcs of his pacing curved closer. His ear paws twitched forward, then back, indecisive, until finally he stopped and tossed his head with a grunt. The crowd gasped as the stallion took a step toward the boy. Then another. A woman covered her mouth with her hand. A rancher muttered, "No damn way." Ethan opened his palm and held it out, not reaching, not pushing, just offering. His heart hammered so loudly he could barely hear his own breath. Midnight Storm lowered his head, nostrils flaring as he tested the air between them. The moment stretched like eternity. Then the horse's muzzle brushed the boy's hand. The sound that followed was not a cheer at first. It was a collective gasp, a disbelieving silence broken only by the shuffle of boots against the fence. Then voices erupted, shouting, swearing, calling it a trick, a miracle. Some applauded wildly, others simply stared, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they believed about the stallion. Ethan lifted his eyes, meeting the horse's gaze. For a moment, they were two wounded souls recognizing one another. He whispered again, "Thank you." From his seat, Whitmore's face hardened. The smile that had curled on his lips earlier was gone, replaced by a tight, seething glare. He had expected a spectacle, yes, but not this. Not humility unraveling his prize animal's fury. His grip on the glass of bourbon tightened until the crystal nearly cracked. Midnight Storm gave a short, sharp snort, but he didn't pull away. Ethan rose slowly to his feet, keeping one hand near the stallion's neck. The boy moved like water, gentle, patient, never forcing the moment. Dust clung to his sweat-soaked shirt. The sun blistered his skin, yet he stood calm as the great black horse allowed him closer still. The crowd's noise faded to a distant hum. To those watching, time seemed suspended. A barefoot boy, a wild stallion, the fragile space between them bridged not by force but by trust. It was the stillness before the storm, the quiet revelation that shattered every assumption the world had made about Midnight Storm. And when the boy finally laid his hand against the horse's neck, stroking the hot, trembling muscle beneath the glossy black coat, a murmur ran through the crowd that sounded almost like awe. The air inside the corral grew heavy. a charged silence broken only by the low, uneven breaths of the stallion. Ethan stood close enough now to feel the warmth radiating from Midnight Storm's flank, his fingers brushing the black mane that rippled in the breeze. For an instant, he thought the horse would lunge, rear, and send him into the dirt like every man before. Instead, Midnight Storm stood, trembling but still, as if weighing the boy's sincerity. The crowd was restless. Some jeered, urging the horse to throw him, while others, against their own will, found themselves hoping the fragile connection would hold. Whitmore's friends laughed nervously, muttering excuses about tricks or hidden training, anything to dismiss what they saw with their own eyes. But there was no trick, just a boy and a horse suspended in an unlikely moment of trust. Ethan leaned closer, whispering into the stallion's ear, "I don't want to hurt you. I just want to ride with you, not on you." His hand stroked the horse's neck, gentle and deliberate. The stallion shivered, muscles rippling under his coat, then exhaled a long, low breath. Gathering his courage, Ethan placed a foot against the side rail of the corral, then shifted, gripping the horse's mane with both hands. The crowd gasped as he swung his leg over the animal's broad back, sliding onto him bareback. No saddle, no reins, nothing but the trembling bond between them. For one terrifying heartbeat, Midnight Storm froze. His ears flicked back, hooves stomping against the ground. A deep grunt rose from his chest. The crowd braced, expecting the explosion. But the stallion did not buck. He did not rear. Instead, he shifted into motion, walking stiffly at first, then pacing the circle of the corral with the boy balanced lightly on his back. The sight was surreal. A child, dirty and barefoot, riding the most feared horse in Texas as though they had known each other all their lives. The silence of the crowd broke into uproar. Some shouted disbelief, others cheered wildly, and a few cursed under their breath, tearing up losing bets. But the boy heard none of it. He leaned forward, pressing his cheek against the stallion's mane, whispering words meant for no ears but the horse's. Whitmore rose from his chair, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. His glass of bourbon slipped from his hand, shattering on the porch beside him. He had expected a child's broken body, a crowd entertained by cruelty. Instead, before him was a miracle, and with it the humiliation of seeing his prized beast yield to someone he considered worthless. 3 minutes! A voice from the crowd shouted. Another voice echoed, "It's been 3!" Ethan guided nothing, demanded nothing. Midnight Storm simply carried him, each stride slower, more assured, until the rhythm of hooves in the dirt seemed like the heartbeat of something ancient. The stallion's head dipped, his ears no longer pinned back, but flicking softly, listening to the boy's murmured words. At the sound of the time called, the corral erupted into chaos. Cheers thundered, boots stomped against wood, and even hardened ranchers wiped at their eyes in disbelief. The barefoot boy had done what no champion, no millionaire, no legend of the rodeo had managed. He had ridden the unrideable. Ethan slid down from the stallion's back with quiet grace, landing in the dust. He turned to face Whitmore, sweat streaking his face, his shirt clinging to his thin frame. Midnight Storm stayed beside him, the tip of his muzzle brushing against the boy's shoulder, like a companion rather than a beast subdued. "I don't want your money," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the hush that fell when he spoke. "I only want him to be free. If you let me, I'll give him the life he deserves." Gasps rippled through the spectators. Some cursed under their breath. One of Whitmore's guests spat in disbelief. To reject $1 million, especially for a boy who had nothing, seemed insane. But Ethan's eyes never wavered from Whitmore's, filled not with defiance but with conviction. Whitmore's jaw clenched, his pride boiling. He had crafted the wager to prove his supremacy, to show the world that even in failure, no man could claim what was his. Now, before a crowd of witnesses, a child had undone him, not with strength or force, but with humility. The stallion shifted beside Ethan, brushing him again with his muzzle. The gesture was simple, but to those who saw it, it carried the weight of a decision. Midnight storm had chosen, and as the sun dropped low in the Texas sky, painting the corral in amber light, the image seared itself into every watching heart. A boy who owned nothing standing beside the untamable horse he had not conquered, but befriended. The ranch yard seethed with noise, a wave of disbelief crashing against the rails of the corral. Bets were torn up in angry hands. Men shouted accusations of trickery. Women fanned themselves as though to steady fainting hearts. Yet through it all, the boy stood in the dust beside Midnight Storm, his hand resting against the stallion's neck, the animal as calm as if he had been born to follow him. The chaos of the crowd could not break the strange, sacred stillness between them. Charles Whitmore stepped forward at last. He descended from his terrace like a king forced to approach the gallows. His boots struck the dirt with sharp authority, his face pale beneath his silver hair. For a moment he stared at the boy, then at the stallion, his lips twisting into something between a snarl and a smile. "You've made quite a scene," he said, his voice low but carrying. "And you've embarrassed me before my guests. Congratulations." His eyes narrowed, hard as steel. "But the horse is mine. Money was the wager, not ownership. You've proved your point. Now take the cash and leave." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Many nodded. Surely the boy would accept. $1 million was salvation. But Ethan's gaze did not falter. "I don't want your money," he said simply. His voice was soft but clear, slicing through the roar around him. "I want him. Midnight Storm has chosen me. That's the only reward I came for." The gasps were louder this time, shocked laughter spilling from the terrace. "The boy's insane," someone muttered. "Rejecting $1 million?" Others whispered that maybe it was a trick, a ploy to win sympathy. But Ethan's face betrayed nothing but quiet resolve. Whitmore's smile vanished. "You dare stand on my land and tell me what's mine? That horse cost me more than you'll ever see in your miserable life. He eats better than you ever have. And you think a moment in the dust makes him yours?" Ethan touched the stallion's neck, feeling the steady thrum beneath the skin. He decided, "Not me. If you really believe you own him, then let him prove it." The challenge fell like a stone into water, ripples spreading through the crowd. Whitmore blinked, then laughed bitterly. "What did you say?" "Let him choose," Ethan repeated. "Stand at one end of the corral, I'll stand at the other. Call him. If he comes to you, I'll walk away and never ask again. If he comes to me—" His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "Then he's mine." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the cicadas outside the yard seemed to pause. Whitmore's men shifted uneasily. His guests leaned forward with morbid fascination. The arrogance of the wager was undeniable, yet so was the honesty in the boy's demand. Whitmore's pride could not resist. His voice cut the air like a knife. Fine. Let's give the people their show. We'll see if this beast truly knows loyalty. The corral was cleared. The crowd pressed back against the rails. Whitmore positioned himself at the southern end, his white suit glowing in the sun, his voice already booming with confidence. Ethan walked to the northern end, his feet raw against the dirt, his hands trembling but steady as he laid one last stroke against the stallion's muzzle. Midnight Storm stood in the center, tossing his head, eyes darting between the two figures. Dust swirled around his legs, his ears twitching at the tension. The boy whispered once more, "Choose, friend. Choose where you belong." "Come here, Storm!" Whitmore's command rang out, harsh and commanding. He smacked his gloved hand against his thigh, his tone the same he used with men he considered beneath him. "Come, boy!" Ethan raised his hand, palm open, and spoke barely above the wind. "It's your choice. If you want me, I'm here." His words trembled with vulnerability, but they carried the weight of trust. For a long, torturous moment, the stallion did not move. The crowd held its breath, eyes darting between millionaire and orphan, between wealth and nothingness. Then, slowly, Midnight Storm lowered his head and began to walk. At first one step, then another. The muscles rippled under his black coat as he closed the distance, not to Whitmore, who barked louder, commanding, but to the barefoot boy, standing with nothing but an open hand. Gasps erupted. "No, no way," a man stammered. Whitmore's face drained of color, his lips tightening into a hard line. Midnight Storm reached Ethan and pressed his muzzle into the boy's chest with a deep, resonant snort. The gesture was not of submission, but of recognition, the final seal on the bond they had formed. Ethan wrapped his arms around the stallion's head, burying his face in the thick black mane as tears stung his eyes. The corral exploded with noise. Some cheered wildly, others jeered, but no one could deny what they had seen. Whitmore's pride, his fortune, his authority had all been undone by a boy with nothing but honesty. Whitmore stood frozen, fists clenched so tight his knuckles whitened. He had lost, not the wager, but something far greater. His command, his pride, the illusion that money ruled every living thing. And in that loss, he saw the eyes of the crowd upon him, no longer admiring, but judging, their whispers like knives. "Take him, then," he spat finally, his voice dripping venom. "But know this, boy, you've made an enemy you won't soon forget." The words clung to the hot air like a curse. Ethan heard them, but did not flinch. He pressed his forehead to Midnight Storm's and whispered softly, "We're together now." And in that moment, under the burning Texas sun, the choice was made, not by the millionaire, not by the boy, but by the stallion who would never again bow to arrogance. The sun had dipped low by the time Ethan left the Whitmore ranch behind, his hand resting lightly on Midnight Storm's mane as the stallion walked beside him. The crowd's roar had faded into a distant echo, replaced by the steady rhythm of hooves against dirt and the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees. With every step away from Whitmore's land, the boy felt lighter, as though the weight of years had lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he wasn't wandering alone. They traveled for hours under the shifting sky. Midnight Storm moved with wary grace, his muscles coiled but calm, never straying far from Ethan's side. The boy spoke softly as they walked, telling the horse stories he hadn't told anyone in years. About his father's laugh, about the nights he used to lie awake in the loft, listening to rain drip through the roof about the loneliness that had followed him like a shadow since he was old enough to understand the word orphan. Midnight Storm responded with snorts, with the occasional flick of his ears, with a presence so steady it made Ethan feel for once that someone was listening. By dawn, they reached the small town of Marble Falls, nestled between the rolling hills and the winding Colorado River. It wasn't much, just a main street lined with brick storefronts, a diner with faded neon, and a feed store whose windows smelled of dust and grain. To Ethan, it looked like salvation. To the horse, it looked like freedom. The townsfolk noticed them the moment they entered. Men paused at the gas station pump. Women froze in the middle of sweeping porches. Children pressed their noses against glass windows. A barefoot boy with ragged clothes leading a black stallion as proud and shining as a legend. It was a sight too strange to ignore. Whispers followed them down the street, rising like the hum of bees. Ethan led Midnight Storm to the edge of town, where the clang of hammer against iron rang from a weathered building. The sign above the door read, Dawson and Son Blacksmith, though the N Son had long since been painted over. A broad-shouldered man with a gray beard worked at the forge, sparks flying as he shaped a horseshoe on the anvil. When he noticed the boy and horse at his gate, he set down his hammer, wiped his hands on his leather apron, and narrowed his eyes. "You lost, kid?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Ethan shook his head. "I'm looking for work, and a place for him." He gestured toward Midnight Storm, who lifted his head, ears pricked forward as if judging the man. The blacksmith stepped closer, his gait heavy but steady. His weathered hands traced the air near the stallion without touching, his eyes sharp with experience. "Fine-looking animal," he muttered. "But he's no ordinary horse. Where'd you steal him from?" "I didn't steal him," Ethan said quickly, his voice breaking with urgency. "He chose me. Everyone at Whitmore's ranch saw it." The name Whitmore drew a reaction. The man's brow furrowed, his mouth tightening. He had no love for the millionaire. Few in those parts did. "If that's true," he said slowly, "you're carrying more trouble than you realize." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I just need a chance. A place to keep him safe." The silence stretched. At last, the man sighed, leaning back on his heels. "Name's Hank Dawson. I've got an empty stall in the back and a cot in the loft, if you don't mind hard work. You pull your weight here, maybe we'll figure something out." Ethan's chest swelled with gratitude. "Yes, sir. I'll work as hard as I can." Hank opened the gate, and Midnight Storm stepped through, his hooves striking sparks against the gravel. The stallion paused only to glance back at Ethan before entering the barn, as if giving his approval. Life settled into a rhythm in Marble Falls. Ethan rose at dawn to feed and groom the stallion, his hands learning every ripple of muscle beneath the glossy black coat. He mucked stalls, hauled water, swept the forge, and watched Hank shape metal with the patience of stone. In the evenings, when the work was done, he sat outside the barn stroking Midnight Storm's mane as the Texas sky turned crimson and the first stars began to shine. The townsfolk remained curious. Some were suspicious, convinced the horse had been stolen. Others whispered admiration, calling Ethan the boy who tamed the untamable. Children gathered near the fence, daring each other to touch the stallion's flank, though none had the courage. A few kind souls, like the woman who ran the diner, slipped Ethan extra bread or a slice of pie, murmuring, "For the boy and his horse." Still, beneath the fragile peace, a shadow lingered. Ethan could feel it in the way strangers stared too long, in the muttered warnings Hank offered before bed. Whitmore was not a man to accept humiliation quietly. His pride had been wounded, and men like him did not forgive. But for now, Ethan let himself breathe. He had a roof above his head, food in his belly, and midnight storm in the stall beside him. For the first time, he felt the stirrings of something he had never known: belonging. And though he sensed the storm yet to come, Ethan clung to the present. The sound of the hammer ringing in Hank's forge, the smell of hay and iron, the soft nicker of the stallion in the twilight. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. And to a boy who had walked the world alone, it was everything. Marble Falls seemed peaceful in the daylight. A town where the river ran quiet under the bridge and children played stickball in the dirt streets. Ethan began to imagine he could build a life here, simple but steady, with midnight storm grazing in the pasture behind Hank Dawson's forge. Each day, his bond with the stallion deepened. The horse no longer pinned his ears at every sound, no longer shied from the touch of others when Ethan was near. Together they walked along the riverbank, the black coat of the Mustang glistening in the Texas sun. And for the first time in years, Ethan smiled without forcing it. But peace is never free when pride has been wounded. Charles Whitmore's humiliation festered like a wound that would not heal. At his estate, he brooded over bourbon, replaying the moment when the stallion had walked away from him in front of 100 witnesses. He had money, land, and men at his command, but all of it felt hollow compared to the image of a barefoot boy stealing his glory. That night, he summoned his foreman Cole Brandt and a handful of trusted hands. "Find the horse," Whitmore ordered, his voice cold. "Bring him back. I don't care what you do with the boy." Cole hesitated, but the glint in Whitmore's eyes left no room for argument. Soon after, a black truck rolled out under the cover of darkness, carrying men who smelled of whiskey and violence. Ethan awoke in the small cot above the forge to the sound of hoofbeats and a sharp clang against the barn door. His heart leapt into his throat. Grabbing the pocket knife from his bag, he stumbled down the ladder, bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. The night air was heavy, the only light spilling from a lantern Hank had left by the forge. 2 figures were crouched at the barn door, one prying at the latch with a crowbar, the other holding a rope coiled in his hands. Midnight storm snorted angrily inside, hooves striking against the stall floor. The sound of iron against wood carried a promise of violence. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking the silence. The men froze, then turned. One laughed under his breath. "Well, look who we've got here. The little hero himself." "Step aside, kid," the other warned, his voice like gravel. "This ain't your fight. We just came for the horse." "You're not taking him," Ethan said, holding the knife in trembling hands. His chest heaved, fear surging, but his body did not move from the door. "You'll have to go through me first." The taller man stepped forward, swinging the crowbar onto his shoulder. "That can be arranged." Before he could close the distance, a shout boomed through the yard. "Enough!" Hank Dawson stormed from the forge with a hammer in his hand, the lantern light glinting off his gray beard and steel-hard eyes. Behind him came neighbors roused from their beds, Mrs. Carter clutching a broom, the young butcher with a cleaver still stained from the day's work, a retired soldier named Boone carrying his old hunting rifle. One by one, townsfolk filled the yard, their faces grim with determination. The intruders hesitated. The odds had shifted in a heartbeat. "You boys best be on your way," Hank growled, standing broad in the lantern light. "This town doesn't take kindly to thieves." The man with the crowbar sneered, but his bravado faltered under the weight of so many eyes. He spat into the dirt. "This ain't over," he muttered. Then, with a sharp gesture to his partner, he turned and disappeared into the night, the black truck growling as it sped away. Silence fell heavy after their departure, broken only by the restless snorts of midnight storm inside the barn. Ethan's grip on the knife loosened as his knees threatened to buckle. Hank placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You all right, boy?" the blacksmith asked. Ethan nodded, though his breath came shallow. They were here for him. Whitmore sent them. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances. The name carried weight, even here. Whitmore's wealth stretched far, his influence deeper than most dared to admit. Mrs. Carter tightened her shawl around her shoulders. "If he wants that horse, he won't stop. You know that." Hank's jaw set like stone. "Then he'll have to come through all of us." In the days that followed, Marble Falls changed. Neighbors took turns watching the forge at night. Lamps burned later in windows. Shotguns were cleaned and leaned by doors, and whispers filled the diner and the feed store. Ethan felt the eyes of the town on him wherever he went, some filled with admiration, others with fear. He hadn't meant to drag them into his fight, but now their lives were tangled with his. At night, lying on the cot, he listened to midnight storm shifting in the stall below, the steady sound of hooves against straw. He whispered to the horse through the boards, "I won't let them take you, no matter what." The stallion answered with a soft snort, as if he understood. The shadows of Whitmore's wrath had reached Marble Falls, and though the boy and the horse had found a place to belong, they knew the storm was only beginning. By the time the morning sun rose over Marble Falls, the story of the midnight intrusion had already spread. At the diner, whispers rolled like smoke between coffee cups. At the feed store, men spoke in hushed voices about trucks seen on the back road. In the church, women murmured prayers for the boy and his horse. Fear had crept into every corner, but with it came a spark of defiance. Ethan could feel the town's eyes following him as he walked the main street. Some faces were sympathetic, nodding with quiet encouragement. Others were wary, calculating whether standing beside him was worth the risk of Whitmore's wrath. He understood. The millionaire's reach was long, and people had seen what happened to those who crossed him. But even with doubt in the air, there was something else too. A sense of pride that their small town had something worth defending. Hank Dawson never said much about that night, but his actions spoke clearly. He reinforced the locks on the barn, sharpened his tools until they gleamed, and stood at the forge with a fire in his eyes Ethan hadn't seen before. "He thinks we're afraid," Hank muttered as sparks leapt from the anvil. "But he's never met Marble Falls when it's got something to protect." It wasn't long before outsiders came. Reporters first, drawn by rumors of a boy who had done the impossible. They spilled from their cars with notebooks and cameras, chasing Ethan down the street, shouting questions about midnight storm. Ethan tried to ignore them, ducking behind Hank's broad frame, but they followed, relentless. Then came Sarah Collins, a young journalist from the Dallas Morning News. Unlike the others, she didn't push or shout. She approached the forge quietly, her notepad tucked under her arm, and introduced herself with a calm smile. "I'm here to tell the truth," she said, her eyes steady on Ethan. "And the truth is, people need to hear your story." Ethan hesitated. "What good will it do?" Whitmore will just get angrier. Maybe, Sarah admitted, but if enough people are watching, it'll be harder for him to crush you in the dark. Hank nodded in agreement. Light's the only thing that scares men like him. So Ethan told her, halting at first, then with growing confidence. He spoke of his father's lessons, of the long walk from Austin, of the moment midnight storm had touched his hand for the first time. Sarah wrote every word, her pencil scratching across the page like it was racing the wind. When she finished, she knelt to look Ethan in the eye. "This isn't just about you," she said. "It's about every little town that's ever been stepped on by men with too much money. You and that horse. You give people hope." Days later, the headline appeared across Texas. "The orphan who tamed the untamable." The article spread faster than wildfire on dry grass. Newspapers from Houston to Amarillo picked it up, and soon radio stations were telling the tale of the barefoot boy and the black stallion who defied a millionaire. Letters began arriving in Marble Falls, some scrawled by hand, others typed on elegant stationery. Strangers wrote to say they believed in Ethan, that he should hold on to the horse no matter what came. Some offered money, others prayers. The attention thrilled some in town and terrified others. The diner filled with arguments, men pounding fists on counters, women raising their voices. "We can't fight Whitmore," one man warned. "He'll bury this place." But others shot back. "Maybe it's time someone stood up to him. If a boy can, why can't we?" The weight of it pressed on Ethan's chest. He hadn't asked for any of this. He only wanted to protect Midnight Storm. But now he could feel the hopes of strangers settling on his shoulders, turning his quiet act of courage into a battle larger than himself. At night, lying in the loft, he listened to the stallion's breathing below and whispered, "I don't know if I can carry all this." Midnight Storm would nicker softly in response, as if reminding him that he wasn't carrying it alone. Whitmore's anger boiled hotter with every printed word. He slammed the newspaper onto his desk, bourbon spilling from his glass. "They're making me the villain," he raged to Cole Brandt. "That boy's no hero. He stole from me. And if the courts won't fix it, then I'll take matters into my own hands." Cole shifted uneasily. "Sir, the eyes of the whole state are on you now. If you make the wrong move—" "Then I'll blind them all," Whitmore snapped, his voice sharp as broken glass. And so the fire spread, not just in Marble Falls but across Texas, a flame of attention and defiance that would not be smothered. For some it was hope, for others it was danger. For Ethan it was the beginning of a battle he had never wanted, but could no longer avoid. The story that had once been confined to dusty roads and ranch fences now blazed across Texas like a summer storm. Headlines carried Ethan's name and Midnight Storm's legend. Talk shows debated the PawPulse, meaning of ownership, and preachers in Sunday pulpits spoke of faith and freedom, weaving the tale of boy and horse into sermons about justice. For Marble Falls, the attention felt both like a shield and a target. People came from nearby towns to see the stallion for themselves, crowding the fences with wide-eyed children and skeptical ranchers. And though Ethan tried to remain the same quiet boy he had always been, he felt the world pressing closer every day. Charles Whitmore, meanwhile, sat at the center of his estate like a general plotting a war. He had not smiled since the day the stallion chose another. His rage grew sharper with every column that painted him as a tyrant, and every letter that praised the barefoot boy who had humiliated him. Pride had always been his lifeblood, and now it burned like poison in his veins. On a muggy evening, Whitmore summoned his lawyers. They came in black cars that lined his drive, carrying briefcases polished like mirrors. They sat in his study beneath the mounted horns of long-dead trophies, while he paced before them, glass in hand. "The boy's story is touching," Whitmore sneered. "But law doesn't care about stories. That horse is mine. I paid for him, I housed him, I fed him. The papers prove it. I want you to bury this child under every statute you can find. If it takes 100 suits, then file them. If it takes a judge in my pocket, then buy him." The lead attorney, a man with slicked hair and a cold smile, nodded. "We'll start with a claim of theft. From there, we'll escalate to damages, trespassing, and endangerment. Even if he resists, the costs alone will ruin him." Whitmore downed the bourbon in his glass, the amber liquid catching firelight. "Good. Let him drown in debt before he ever tastes victory." News of the legal summons arrived in Marble Falls like a hammer strike. Hank Dawson was the first to read the envelope, his jaw tightening as he handed it to Ethan. The boy's hands shook as he unfolded the paper, the words blurring before his eyes. "Plaintiff, Charles Whitmore. Defendant, Ethan Miller." "They're saying you stole him," Hank said quietly. Ethan's throat closed. "But everyone knows he chose me." "Truth doesn't always matter in court," Hank replied grimly. "Whitmore's counting on that." The town gathered in the diner that night, voices rising in anger and worry. Some argued they couldn't stand against Whitmore's money. Others insisted they had to fight, that giving in would mean surrendering more than just a horse. Mrs. Carter slammed her hand on the counter. "That boy's done more for this town's spirit than any of us in years. We won't let Whitmore take him." But fear lingered. Farmers muttered about losing their land, shopkeepers about boycotts. Whitmore's shadow stretched long, and everyone knew it. Then Sarah Collins returned, her notebook tucked under her arm. "I'll help," she said, firmly. "I know lawyers who still care about justice. People are watching, more than you realize. If Whitmore thinks he can bully his way through, let's give him a fight he won't expect." Ethan looked around at the faces in the diner, the butcher, the preacher, Hank with his soot-stained hands, children peeking from behind aprons. His chest ached with the weight of their hopes and fears. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," he admitted. Hank put a steady hand on his shoulder. "Strength ain't about never being scared. It's about standing anyway. You've done it once. You can do it again." The days that followed became preparation. Hank drilled the boy in chores to keep his hands busy, while Sarah drove to Austin to meet with a young attorney she trusted. The town rallied, raising funds in jars left on counters, collecting signatures from witnesses who had seen the corral that day. Even those who doubted before the now understood. This fight was no longer just about a horse. It was about dignity, about whether a boy with nothing could stand against a man with everything. Whitmore, from his estate, watched with cold satisfaction. "Let them gather," he murmured to Cole Brandt. "It'll make their fall even sweeter. They don't know the power of paper and pen. They don't know what money can buy." But beneath his sneer, unease gnawed. The image of the stallion choosing the boy haunted him still, as vivid as the day it happened. Midnight Storm had not only defied him, he had humiliated him. And in that humiliation, Whitmore found no rest, so the stage shifted from dirt and railings to courtrooms and ink, from the roar of crowds to the silence of judges. Yet the stakes remained the same: a horse that refused to be broken, and a boy who dared to stand beside him. The courthouse in Austin stood tall and cold, its limestone walls weathered by decades of battles waged not with fists or guns, but with words and laws. On the morning of the trial, the steps leading up to the doors swarmed with people. Reporters adjusting their cameras, townsfolk from Marble Falls who had risen before dawn to support Ethan, and strangers drawn by the legend of a boy and a stallion. It felt less like a legal hearing and more like a trial of myth, with whispers running through the crowd. That's him. The boy who tamed the untamable. Ethan stood at the base of the steps, his worn shirt buttoned as neatly as he could manage, his father's pocket knife heavy in his pocket like an anchor. His knees trembled, but Hank Dawson's steady hand on his shoulder kept him from faltering. Midnight Storm, of course, couldn't enter, but Ethan imagined the stallion's dark eyes on him, lending him strength. Inside, the courtroom was a world of polished wood, tall windows, and silence sharp enough to cut. Whitmore sat at one table, his white suit immaculate, his expression carved from stone. Around him clustered a half-dozen lawyers in tailored suits, their briefcases spilling papers like weapons. Whitmore exuded confidence, nodding to the judge with the ease of a man who believed the system belonged to him. At the opposite table, Ethan sat beside Sarah Collins and the young attorney she had brought, Javier Torres, a man with a simple suit, weary eyes, and the calm of someone who had faced impossible odds before. Javier greeted Ethan with a reassuring nod. "We don't need to match his money," he whispered. "We just need the truth." The trial began with Whitmore's lawyers rising one after another, their voices smooth and commanding. They presented purchase records, bills of sale, documents stamped and signed. Midnight Storm, the lead attorney declared, was bought legally by Mr. Whitmore at auction. He is property, no different than land or cattle. The boy in question stole him, and in doing so endangered himself and others. The words fell heavy, echoing across the chamber. Some in the gallery nodded reluctantly. The law was clear, at least on paper. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, lips curling in triumph. Then Javier stood, his voice quiet at first but gaining strength. "No one denies the purchase. But what cannot be denied either is the wager Mr. Whitmore made before dozens of witnesses. He promised the horse would belong to whomever he accepted. He turned this into more than a contest. It was a contract, witnessed and agreed upon." The courtroom stirred. Murmurs rose from the gallery as Javier called the first witness, a ranch hand who had been at the corral. Then another, a woman from San Antonio who had traveled to see the famous challenge. One by one, they testified that they had seen the boy enter the ring, unarmed, and walk out not with conquest, but with a bond. Each voice chipped away at Whitmore's fortress of pride. The turning point came when Javier called an unexpected witness, Donnie Zamora, a landowner who had once counted himself among Whitmore's allies. He took the stand slowly, avoiding Whitmore's furious stare. "I was there," Zamora said, his voice trembling but steady. "I saw the horse walk past Whitmore, straight to the boy. And I heard Whitmore's words. He said if the horse chose him, then so be it. Well, the horse chose." A hush fell. Whitmore slammed his hand against the table. "Lies!" he roared, his composure cracking for the first time. "That animal is mine. No boy, no trick, no soft words will change that." His voice echoed like a whip through the chamber, but instead of silencing the room, it revealed the depth of his desperation. At last, the judge turned to Ethan. "Son, why do you believe the horse belongs with you?" Ethan rose slowly, his small frame dwarfed by the room. He clutched the pocket knife in his palm, then lifted his eyes to meet the judge's. Because he chose me, he said softly. Not because I forced him, not because I bought him. He chose me. He's not just an animal locked in a chowthant stall. He's like me. He's been hurt, abandoned, and he doesn't trust easy. But he trusted me. If you send him back, you'll break him, and you'll break me too. His words were simple, almost childlike, yet they carried a weight that filled the room. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the judge lowered his gaze, the silence thick as the Texas heat. Whitmore seethed, whispering to his attorneys, but the air in the courtroom had shifted. The spectacle of wealth and paperwork no longer mattered against the sight of a boy standing bare before the law, with nothing but his truth. When the closing arguments ended, the judge withdrew. The minutes stretched like hours, the crowd restless, Ethan's heart pounding in his chest. Then at last, the door opened and the judge returned, his expression unreadable. He raised the gavel. This court recognizes that though Mr. Whitmore legally purchased the horse, he voluntarily relinquished that right by his wager, witnessed and confirmed. Therefore, ownership is granted to the defendant, Ethan Miller. Midnight Storm shall remain in his care. The gavel struck. Cheers erupted in the gallery, echoing through the halls. Sarah embraced Ethan, tears in her eyes, while Hank lifted him into a rough, proud hug. Whitmore sat frozen, his face bloodless, his fists white with rage. As he rose to leave, he leaned close enough for Ethan to hear his hissed words. "This isn't over, boy. You don't know the enemies you've made." Ethan didn't answer. He only looked toward the window, where the sunlight streamed in like freedom, and thought of Midnight Storm waiting for him. For the first time, justice had spoken louder than power. The courthouse doors swung wide, and sunlight poured over the crowd like a blessing. The verdict still echoed in Ethan's ears, the gavel strike resounding in his chest, as though it had been hammered into his very heart. People surged forward on the steps, clapping his back, calling his name. Some shouted blessings, others simply wept. To them, it was more than a legal victory. It was proof that the powerful could be held to account, that truth could triumph over wealth. Sarah Collins scribbled notes furiously, her hands shaking with excitement. "You don't understand what you've done," she whispered to Ethan as they pushed through the throng. "This will be on every front page in the state by morning, maybe the country." Ethan's face flushed. He wasn't thinking of newspapers or headlines. His only thought was of Midnight Storm, waiting in the stall at Hank's forge. He imagined the horse's deep, dark eyes, the breath that smelled of hay and dust, the steady sound of hooves when he shifted in the straw. More than any verdict, that bond was his freedom. Whitmore, however, walked from the courthouse like a man carrying fire in his chest. He ignored the reporters clamoring for comment, shoved past hands that reached for answers, and climbed into his black car without a word. But as the engine roared, he leaned close to the glass and glared at Ethan. His lips barely moved, but the boy caught the shape of the words. "This isn't over." Back in Marble Falls, the town erupted as if they themselves had won the trial. The diner served free pie to every patron. The preacher rang the church bell, and children ran through the streets chanting Ethan's name. Hank Dawson sat on the porch of his forge, pipe smoke curling around his weathered face, and watched as strangers streamed into town just to catch a glimpse of the boy and the stallion who had humbled a millionaire. That night, Ethan returned to the barn. Midnight Storm lifted his head the moment the boy entered, snorting softly. as though he had known all along. Ethan wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, pressing his cheek against the coarse black mane. "We did it," he whispered. "You're free now. No one can take you away." But even as he spoke, Ethan felt the weight of Whitmore's shadow. The verdict had given him legal rights, but it had not stripped the millionaire of his pride or his reach. He remembered Whitmore's eyes, cold, promising vengeance. Freedom had been won, but it was fragile, like glass in a storm. Still, that night, the town celebrated. Lanterns were strung along the main street, guitars strummed old songs, and people danced under the stars. Sarah raised a glass and toasted, "To Ethan and Midnight Storm, proof that courage still has a place in this world." The cheer that followed rolled through Marble Falls like thunder. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, Hank beside him. The blacksmith's eyes softened as he looked down at the boy. "Your father would be proud," he said simply. The words struck deep, filling a hollow Ethan hadn't realized was still aching. He swallowed hard and nodded, unable to speak. Later, as the noise faded and the stars burned brighter overhead, Ethan led Midnight Storm to the pasture behind the forge. The stallion trotted free in the moonlight, mane whipping like a banner. Ethan leaned against the fence, his chest aching with joy. "You're not mine," he whispered, "but you're with me. And that's enough." In that quiet moment, under the wide Texas sky, justice felt more than a verdict. It felt alive, breathing in the steady rhythm of hooves, carried on the soft wind that rustled the mesquite. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to believe in the word he had never dared to hope for before. Home. The summer air in Marble Falls carried a sweetness that had been missing for years. It was more than the scent of mesquite smoke or the bread cooling on kitchen windowsills. It was the feeling of release, the lifting of a burden the town hadn't realized it bore. With Whitmore's grip broken in the courthouse, people walked taller, voices rang louder, and laughter carried farther across the riverbanks. The townsfolk decided there must be a celebration, not just for Ethan, but for themselves, for the spirit of defiance that had bound them together. Preparations began at dawn. Strings of colored lanterns were hung across Main Street, glowing like fireflies as the sun began to set. Long tables were hauled into the open square, covered in gingham cloth and piled with food: barbecued brisket, cornbread, peach cobblers, and sweet tea sweating in glass jars. The air shimmered with music as fiddles and guitars tuned for the night ahead, their notes already coaxing children into giggles and stomping feet. Ethan hardly knew what to make of it all. He had never been the center of anything before. Most of his life he had been invisible, a shadow in the corner of barns and alleys. Now, everywhere he turned, hands clapped his back, voices called his name, and strangers smiled at him as if they had always known him. He felt shy under the weight of their attention, but whenever he faltered, Midnight Storm was there, towering and black, the glow of lanterns reflecting off his sleek coat. The stallion carried himself with quiet dignity, as if he knew the celebration was as much his as the boys. Hank Dawson watched from the porch of the forge, his pipe clenched between his teeth, pride hidden beneath his gruff demeanor. He had helped raise the lanterns, hammered extra nails into the tables, and now he stood with arms crossed, surveying it all as though guarding it. When Ethan passed, Hank gave him a nod that said more than any words. "You belong here now." The festival swelled with life as darkness fell. Songs rang out, Old cowboy ballads that spoke of long trails and lost loves, mixed with hymns of gratitude. Boots stomped on the wooden planks of the square as couples danced, skirts twirling and hats tipping. Children darted between the tables, chasing each other with sparklers, their laughter lifting into the night sky. Sarah Collins moved through the crowd with her notebook, recording the sights and sounds, though more often than not she set it aside to join the dance, her face lit with genuine joy. She had chronicled the fight, the courtroom, the shadow of Whitmore's wrath, but tonight she wanted to capture hope. "This is what people need to remember," she told Ethan when they crossed paths. "Not just the struggle, but what comes after." Ethan smiled, though a weight lingered at the edges of his heart. He couldn't shake the memory of Whitmore's eyes as he hissed his threat outside the courthouse. Even now, as music and laughter wrapped around him, he felt the chill of that shadow. But when Midnight Storm nudged his shoulder, the boy drew strength again. He leaned against the stallion, whispering, "They can't take this from us. Not tonight." The townsfolk insisted Ethan join the dance, pulling him into the circle. At first awkward, he soon found himself laughing, his bare feet kicking up dust in rhythm with the fiddle. For a fleeting moment, he wasn't an orphan or a defendant or a symbol. He was simply a boy among people who had chosen to claim him as their own. As the night wore on, speeches began. The preacher raised his hands and thanked God for courage, for freedom, for the reminder that dignity had no price. Mrs. Carter declared Ethan the pride of Marble Falls, her voice cracking as she tried not to cry. Hank kept his words few, as always, but when he lifted his glass and said, "To the boy and the horse that made us remember who we are," the crowd erupted in cheers. The celebration lasted deep into the night, until the stars wheeled high above and the lanterns swayed in the warm breeze. Ethan slipped away to the edge of the square, where Midnight Storm waited, standing tall against the backdrop of the glowing town. He stroked the stallion's mane, his voice quiet. "This is home, Storm, for both of us." The stallion lowered his head, pressing his muzzle into the boy's chest with a soft snort. The sound was drowned by the music and laughter, but to Ethan it was louder than anything, the sound of belonging. And as Marble Falls sang and danced beneath the Texas sky, the boy and the horse stood together at the edge of the light, part of something greater than themselves, bound not by paper or law, but by choice and by love. The days after the festival carried a glow that lingered like the last embers of a fire. Marble Falls seemed transformed, its people walking lighter, laughing louder, no longer bent under the shadow of Charles Whitmore's reach. For Ethan, every sunrise felt like a gift he hadn't dared dream of before. He rose early, greeted Midnight Storm in the pasture, and carried buckets of water with a smile, his bare feet dusted with morning dew. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. He was part of a place, stitched into its fabric by trust and by love. But the shadow of Whitmore had not vanished. The millionaire retreated into silence, nursing his humiliation in the dark halls of his estate. Rumors whispered through the state. Some said he had left Texas in shame. Others claimed he was plotting revenge. Ethan heard the murmurs, but he refused to let them poison the present. "We've won," he reminded himself, stroking the stallion's sleek black coat. "And even if he comes again, we'll face him together." Midnight Storm thrived in freedom. He ran the open fields with a power that left onlookers breathless, his hooves drumming the earth like thunder. Yet when Ethan whistled, the stallion always returned, ears flicking, eyes bright, lowering his head to the boy's touch. What had begun as survival was now companionship, unbreakable and steady. The people of Marble Falls began to see the pair not as legend, but as family, symbols of resilience who belonged as much to the town as to each other. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Hank Dawson found Ethan by the pasture fence. The blacksmith's hands were blackened with soot, but his eyes were gentle. "You've given this town more than you know," he said. "But don't forget, you've given yourself something too. You've found a home." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. Home. The word felt new, almost fragile, but when he looked at Hank, at the forge, at Midnight Storm grazing peacefully, he believed it. That night, Marble Falls gathered once more in the square, not for a trial or a fight, but simply to be together. Lanterns swung in the warm breeze, guitars strummed slow, aching ballads, and neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing stories. Sarah Collins returned, her notebook tucked away, choosing for once to set aside her pen. "The story's been written," she told Ethan. "Now it belongs to the people." When the music slowed and the crowd hushed, Ethan stepped forward, Midnight Storm at his side. "I don't know much about speeches," he admitted, his voice carrying softly into the night. "But I know this: freedom isn't something you buy or win in court. It's something you fight for every day, with courage, with kindness, with trust. Midnight Storm taught me that, and you all taught me that too." The square erupted in cheers, some wiping tears, others raising glasses. Ethan blushed, lowering his gaze, but when he glanced at Hank, he saw the old man's proud nod, and when he looked at Sarah, her smile assured him that his words had carried farther than he imagined. Later, when the town drifted back to their homes and the lanterns burned low, Ethan led Midnight Storm out beyond the edge of Marble Falls. The night was still, the stars vast and brilliant, the horizon stretching forever. He climbed onto the stallion's bare back, the familiar warmth steady beneath him. With a soft nudge, Midnight Storm surged forward, galloping into the open land, mane streaming, hooves striking sparks from the earth. The wind tore through Ethan's hair, stung his eyes, filled his lungs with fire. He laughed, a sound pure and unburdened, as the world blurred around him. In that moment, there was no court, no millionaire, no shadow of vengeance. There was only a boy and his horse, two souls scarred by the world, but healed by each other, racing side by side into freedom. When they slowed at last, standing on a rise above the valley, Ethan looked back at the twinkling lights of Marble Falls. The town was small, fragile in the vast Texas dark, but it was his. Midnight Storm tossed his head, snorting into the night air, and Ethan pressed a hand against his neck. "We're home," he whispered. "No one can take that from us." The stallion stamped once as if sealing the vow. Together, boy and horse stood against the horizon, the night wide open before them, their bond unshakable. Whatever storms might come, they would meet them not as master and beast, but as equals, as family, as free. And so their story ended not with conquest or wealth, but with the simple truth that had carried them from the first moment in the dust-filled corral. Freedom is not given by the powerful, nor bought with money. It is chosen, earned, and lived, one stride at a time, into the endless horizon. And now I want to hear from you. if you were in Ethan's shoes? Would you have taken the money or fought for freedom like he did? Type 1 if you'd choose freedom, or 0 if you'd walk away with the cash. Drop your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because more powerful stories of courage, love, and the bond between humans and animals are coming your way.